So, today I want to talk about something that I think almost everyone gets completely backwards. And I want to start with a fact that should disturb you a lot more than it does. For the last 80 years, since 1945, the great powers of the world have not fought each other directly. Think about that for a moment. Not once. America and the Soviet Union, two superpowers pointing thousands of nuclear weapons at each other for 40 years, never fought a direct war. America and China, the two largest economies on the planet, have never fought a direct war. The countries with the biggest militaries, the most advanced weapons, the most to gain from defeating a rival, have spent 80 years threatening each other, circling each other, fighting through smaller proxy wars, but never, not one single time, going to war directly with one another. Historians have a name for this. They call it the long peace. And here's the question I want you to sit with before I answer it. Why? Why did the most heavily armed, most aggressive, most powerful nations in human history suddenly stop fighting each other for 80 years? Because if you get the answer to that question wrong, you will not understand the world you are living in right now. And most people get it completely wrong. So let me tell you the answer that most people believe, and then let me tell you why it is wrong. The comfortable story goes like this. After 2 world wars, after the Holocaust, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, humanity finally grew up. We saw the horror of what we were capable of. We became more civilized. We became more moral. We built institutions. We learned to talk instead of fight. War became something barbaric, something from the past, something modern enlightened people simply do not do anymore. That is the story, and it is a very flattering story because it tells us that we are good, that we have progressed, that we are better than our grandparents. And I'm here to tell you today that this story is wrong, completely wrong. Humans did not avoid war for 80 years because we became good. We avoided war because of structure, because the incentives changed, because for a very specific and very temporary set of reasons, war between great powers became irrational. And in 2026, those reasons stopped being true. The structure broke, and once you understand how it broke, you will understand that the war you are watching unfold right now was not an accident. It was not a tragedy that wise leadership could have prevented. It was the logical, predictable result of the rules of the game changing. So let me break this down carefully the way I always do on this channel using structural history and game theory. And I want to start with the framework because the framework is everything. In game theory, we do not ask whether people are good or bad. We assume everyone is rational. We assume everyone is trying to maximize their own interest. And then we ask a simple question. Given the incentives, given the costs and the benefits, what is the rational move? And here is the key insight. Peace is not a moral achievement. Peace is an equilibrium. Peace is what happens when for every player in the game, the cost of starting a war is higher than the benefit of starting a war. When that is true, everyone avoids war, not because they are kind, but because they are rational. And an equilibrium holds for exactly as long as the conditions that created it hold. The moment those conditions change, the equilibrium breaks, and the thing that was unthinkable yesterday becomes inevitable tomorrow. So, the real question is not, why are humans good now? The real question is, what were the structural conditions that made great power war irrational for 80 years? And I want to walk you through 4 of them, because each one is a pillar holding up the long piece, and each one is cracking right now in front of our eyes. Let's start with the first pillar, which is the most obvious one, nuclear weapons. Before 1945, when 2 great powers went to war, the worst-case scenario was that you might lose. You might lose territory. You might lose soldiers. You might lose your empire. That is bad, but it is survivable. Empires lose wars and continue to exist. But after 1945, the worst-case scenario changed completely. Now, if 2 nuclear powers go to war, the worst-case scenario is not that you lose. The worst-case scenario is that everyone dies. Total annihilation. The strategists gave it a perfect name, mutually assured destruction, and the acronym is MAD because it is madness. If I attack you and you can destroy me even as you are dying, then attacking you is suicide, and rational actors do not commit suicide. So, Nuclear weapons did something no peace treaty in history had ever done. They made direct war between the great powers genuinely irrational. Not immoral, irrational. The cost became infinite, and no benefit can outweigh an infinite cost. And on top of that, something even stronger developed, what I have called before the nuclear taboo. For 80 years, no country has used a nuclear weapon in war, not once since Nagasaki. And that taboo became one of the most powerful norms in all of human civilization, because everyone understood that the first country to break it opens a door that can never be closed again. So, that is pillar one. Now, the second pillar is economic interdependence. And this one is subtle, so pay attention. In the old world, your enemy and your trading partner were usually different people. You could go to war with a rival kingdom and barely notice it in your economy. But in the modern globalized world, your enemy is your supplier. Your enemy is your customer. For nearly 80 years, the absence of direct great power war was often interpreted as a sign of human progress, proof that diplomacy had matured, that globalization had softened conflict, and that modern states had outgrown the catastrophic wars of the past. But beneath that comforting interpretation lay something far more structural and far less fragile than optimism. A system of conditions that made large-scale war irrational rather than unnecessary. To understand why the long peace held, it is useful to think in terms of four foundational pillars that quietly supported the post-World War II international order. These pillars did not eliminate rivalry or tension, but they made escalation into full-scale war increasingly costly, risky, and in many cases self-defeating. The first pillar was nuclear deterrence. Once multiple states possessed nuclear weapons, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, war between them became existentially suicidal. Even limited escalation carried the risk of total annihilation. This created what is often described as strategic stability, not peace born of trust, but peace enforced by fear of mutual destruction. The threshold for escalation was so high that even severe crises tended to remain contained. The second pillar was economic interdependence. Over time, global trade networks became deeply integrated, binding rivals together through supply chains, manufacturing dependencies, and consumer markets. A classic illustration of this logic appears in the 1909 work The Great Illusion, which argued that industrial interdependence had made great power war economically irrational. The core idea was simple. Nations that are economically entangled cannot easily destroy one another without inflicting catastrophic self-harm. In such a system, war is not just destructive, it is financially self-defeating. The third pillar was unipolarity, or what political scientists often describe as hegemonic stability. After the Cold War, the United States emerged as the dominant global power, creating a relatively clear hierarchy in international politics. In a system with a single, overwhelming power, uncertainty is reduced. Smaller and emerging powers may resent the hierarchy, but they also recognize the costs of direct confrontation. This clarity reduces the risk of miscalculation, because wars often begin not when one side is clearly dominant, but when both sides mistakenly believe they can win. In contrast, a clear hegemon sets boundaries, enforces norms, and discourages open challenges simply through overwhelming capability. The fourth pillar was the network of international institutions. Organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and global financial and legal frameworks provided more than just diplomacy. They created procedural exits from crises. Even when tensions escalated, these institutions offered a structured environment where states could de-escalate without appearing to surrender. They functioned as neutral scripts, allowing leaders to retreat from confrontation while preserving domestic legitimacy. Together, these four pillars formed the architecture of the long peace. Nuclear weapons made war suicidal, economic interdependence made it unprofitable, unipolarity made it strategically unwise, and institutions made it diplomatically manageable. For decades, this combination suppressed the conditions under which great power war typically emerges. However, this interpretation changes dramatically when viewed through the lens of structural decline. The stability of the system was never permanent. It was contingent. And by 2026, each of these pillars began to weaken simultaneously, not through a single catastrophic event, but through gradual erosion across multiple domains. The first crack appeared in nuclear deterrence. While nuclear weapons still exist and still impose catastrophic risks, the character of warfare has evolved beneath the nuclear threshold. Advances in precision strike systems, drone warfare, cyber capabilities, and artificial intelligence have created new forms of conflict that can inflict significant damage without triggering nuclear retaliation. This creates a dangerous gray zone. States can now harm one another in meaningful ways while remaining just below the threshold that once guaranteed restraint. Over time, repeated low-level escalation normalizes behavior that would once have been unthinkable, slowly eroding the psychological barrier that nuclear weapons originally created. The second pillar, economic interdependence, has also begun to fracture. Instead of reinforcing peace, globalization is increasingly being reinterpreted as vulnerability. Policies such as sanctions, financial restrictions, and supply chain decoupling have transformed economic ties into instruments of coercion. When states begin to view trade not as mutual benefit but as strategic exposure, the logic of interdependence reverses. Efforts toward reshoring, de-dollarization, and technological separation reflect a growing belief that economic connections can be weaponized. Once that belief takes hold, the stabilizing effect of trade weakens significantly. The third pillar, unipolarity, has effectively ended. The international system is now moving toward multipolarity, where several major powers possess comparable influence, but none can impose complete dominance. This shift introduces strategic ambiguity. In a multipolar world, it becomes harder to determine clear red lines, harder to predict responses, and easier for miscalculations to occur. Historically, such transitions are especially unstable. The dynamic is closely associated with the Thucydides trap, where a rising power and an established power enter into structural tension that increases the probability of conflict. In such environments, both sides often misread intentions, overestimate their own position, and underestimate the risks of escalation. The fourth pillar, institutional stability, has also weakened. Institutions that once served as mechanisms for crisis management are increasingly constrained by political fragmentation and veto dynamics. The United Nations Security Council, for example, often struggles to act decisively in major conflicts due to competing great power interests. As institutional authority declines, so too does the availability of neutral off-ramps during crises. Without shared frameworks for de-escalation, disputes are more likely to escalate by momentum rather than be contained by design. What makes this moment particularly significant is not the weakening of any single pillar, but the simultaneous strain across all four. The nuclear threshold is becoming less absolute in practice. Economic ties are being reframed as strategic liabilities. Global hierarchy is dissolving into multipolar competition, and institutions are losing their ability to mediate conflict. The result is not immediate war, but a shift in the underlying logic of international relations. In such a system, behavior changes even before major conflict occurs. When restraint is no longer clearly rewarded, and when hesitation risks exploitation by rivals, states face a structural incentive to act earlier, more decisively, and more aggressively. Even leaders who recognize the dangers are constrained by the fear that unilateral restraint may result in long-term strategic loss. In game-theoretic terms, cooperation becomes harder to sustain when trust in mutual restraint collapses. This is not the first time history has seen such a transformation. The pre-1914 European order provides a sobering parallel. At the time, many observers believed that industrial integration and diplomatic norms had made war obsolete. That confidence was famously captured in The Great Illusion, which reflected a widespread belief that economic interdependence had rendered major war irrational. Yet, within a few years, that assumption collapsed, and Europe descended into a conflict that few had truly expected in its final moments of peace. The lesson is not that war is inevitable, but that long peace is not self-sustaining. It depends on structures that can weaken without dramatic warning. When those structures hold, even rival powers appear stable. When they erode, instability can emerge rapidly and unexpectedly, not because human nature changes, but because the incentives governing state behavior shift. Ultimately, The key insight is that peace is not merely a moral achievement, it is a system outcome. For decades, four reinforcing pillars made large-scale war irrational. As those pillars weaken, the system becomes more sensitive to shocks, miscalculations, and rapid escalation dynamics. Whether this transition leads to renewed stability or deeper instability will depend not on rhetoric or intention alone, but on whether new structures emerge to replace the old ones before the gaps between them widen further.